This webinar will help nonprofit leaders to understand the new field of big data and identify best practices for applying big data analytics across their organization. The Cornerstone OnDemand Foundation is excited to sponsor this presentation, and we thank you for attending. Now, before we begin, a few housekeeping items. To reduce background noise, all lines have been muted. Please note that there is a chat box located in the middle right-hand side of your screen. At any time, please feel free to submit your questions, which we will address in a Q&A at the end of this presentation. Before I hand it over to our presenter, I'd like to take a brief moment to introduce myself and the Cornerstone OnDemand Foundation as the host of this presentation. My name is Justin Waddell, and I work within the Nonprofit Empowerment Program of the Foundation, which was launched in 2009 in an effort to provide learning and talent management technology and pro bono HR consulting services to the nonprofit sector, both domestically and abroad. Today's webinar is part of our nonprofitready.org webinar series, designed to provide expertise and best practices related to talent management and organizational development for nonprofit leaders. For those not yet familiar, nonprofitready.org is the Cornerstone OnDemand Foundation's free professional development portal for nonprofits. In addition to housing all of the Foundation's webinars, nonprofitready.org contains an extensive library of learning resources designed to help advance your nonprofit career and increase your impact within the community. Today's session will be posted to nonprofitready.org within 24 hours. You will receive a follow-up email with a link to this resource. And now, without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to today's presenter, Max Simkoff. Max, thanks again for sharing your expertise today. I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Justin.
So what I'm going to talk about today is how big data analytics is changing the landscape not only of HR, but how the way in which it's changing the HR landscape is relevant to the world of nonprofits. This is an area that I have some unique experience with because I happen to serve on the board of a fairly well-funded Bay Area nonprofit that has been using some of the techniques that we're going to talk about today. So I'm excited to be able to walk you through kind of a real live case study that will touch on some of the things that I discussed later in the presentation. And just by way of some timing and agenda, I'm going to spend ideally about 25 or 30 minutes walking through this presentation. I'll try and leave plenty of time for questions, and I'll monitor the chat screen as we go along to see if items pop up that I can address. So to start at a really high level, I like to discuss some examples of the practical use cases of big data in the world today. Big data has become a buzzword. A lot of people use it not really knowing real life examples of where it's having a widespread impact. And I've picked three examples from three different industries, and one of them involving a nonprofit organization, to show the kind of impact that using big data analytics, and specifically predictive big data analytics, can have on your organization. Some of you may have heard of some of these, and I'll start with Target in retail. Target figured out a way to effectively predict pregnancy. This is a somewhat controversial program that they created starting, I think, in 2002, where they were mining their data set to figure out whether there are certain items that their customers were purchasing that were correlated to life events that they could place advertising campaigns around. And what they found was that they had women who were in their second and third trimesters of pregnancy purchasing baskets of items that were strongly correlated to their eventual due date. And what Target was able to do over time was regress this information back so that they could provide advertising mailers to their customers, to their female customers who were early in their pregnancy, and reach them at a time when they were more apt to be purchasing these products and buying them from Target. This particular program got a lot of coverage when there was an incident at a store actually in Minneapolis where an angry customer stormed into the store, pulled aside the store manager, and took him to task because his daughter had been receiving mailers advertising baby products. His daughter was 17 or 18 years old. He was saying, "Shame on you, Target, for sending this stuff to her." That store manager ended up following up with this customer several days later to reiterate an apology coming from higher up in the corporate ranks of Target. And at that point, on the phone conversation, this customer said, "No, actually, it's I who owe you an apology because it turns out my daughter is pregnant, And it's just kind of an eerie example of where Target had actually known that this man's daughter was pregnant before he did. By the way, this is all public information. You can look it up online, and there's some interesting articles. There was one in the New York Times about this particular program. A somewhat lighter example is in the field of entertainment. Netflix created the House of Cards television series using big data analytics. Now, they did a number of sophisticated things, but at the simplest level, what they did was when they mined their data, they found that their viewership ratings, the people who would actually stay engaged with programs on the Netflix platform, saw an overwhelming amount of overlap between three specific areas. One was political situational dramas. The second were programs that included Kevin Spacey in a lead role. And the third, funnily enough, were, for whatever reason, films and television programs directed by a man named David Fincher, who's a fairly well-known Hollywood director. So what they did was they combined these three things that they found in their data set. They created a situational political drama, in this case, basically a carbon copy of a series that had been running in the UK some 10 or 15 years earlier. They put Kevin Spacey in a lead role. They had David Fincher signed on as the director, and the rest is history. It became a runaway success. And the last example I'll use, which comes from the field of nonprofit, is the University of Toronto. And this is, I think, perhaps the most fascinating example of the three. The University of Toronto found that there are subtle changes in breathing patterns and blood temperature that happen with premature infants that tend to act as bellwethers for serious infections that happen 24 hours later. It is a somewhat unfortunate statistic that of premature infants who get infections, so about 25% of premature infants will get an infection in the NICU, and of that group, I think it's nearly 25% of the 25% will end up seeing that infection become fatal, historically. What the University of Toronto has been able to do now is basically to forecast which premature infants in the NICU are likely to have an infection and start addressing the likely effects of the infection before it actually occurs. So here are three examples from three different industries where big data analytics is clearly having a massive measurable output. And now it's finally being used in the field of HR. I want to talk about what has enabled this to happen. In some cases, a number of companies and customers we talk to say, why is it that it's taken HR so long to embrace this approach? And there's a significant change that's happened with the technology landscape in HR that has only enabled this to be possible recently. And what that is specifically is the ERP landscape. So about 15 or 20 years ago, the core ERP systems that organizations used in HR were very process-centric. They focused around process automation. How do we automate the process of applying for a job, or learning, or performance management, succession, compensation, those types of things. Now we've moved towards a world where organizations are using a unified suite of applications. So they're not just automating processes, but they're linking all of the automated processes they've put systems behind together so that they can see interesting patterns across the processes that they've got automation around. And we've only recently, in the last 4 or 5 years, moved into a world where, because organizations have put this level of automation and unification around their HR systems, that there is a robust amount of data that's being tracked that we can utilize to drive predictive recommendations and take advantage of some of the more usable, practical use cases of big data analytics. You couple this with some key changes in technology that have made it much cheaper and more efficient to do analytics. So with the onset of cloud computing, where systems track every customer's data using the same data or what's called object model, so that it's very easy to look across customers within a single database and find patterns, as well as the mobile and consumerization of the enterprise, which has produced a massive amount of additional data around things like the location that people are applying for a job, right, via their mobile device, or how and when they're engaging with content through a company's learning management system, has created a massive amount of additional data that can be mined. And then lastly, and this is where it has become possible for a number of organizations, including nonprofits now, to be doing relatively sophisticated big data analysis projects, is that the tools that are used to perform big data analytics have become much, much cheaper and in many cases free. So Hadoop is the best example of this. Hadoop is an open source framework for accessing and processing large data sets. Open source means that it's free. Anybody can use it. and a number of organizations with very limited resources have found that training just a single person or two within their analytics department to work with Hadoop enables them to take large data sets they already have out of the systems they're already using and perform some of the analyses like the ones that we're going to talk about. So I want to now get a bit more specific and talk about how and where is big data analytics being done in HR. And I'm going to talk about specific areas of HR where it's being done and specific questions that it's being used to answer. And then I'm going to talk about the core components that any big data analytics project should include when you're trying to answer questions like these. I'm going to finish with some examples of findings that we've seen across our group of organizations that we work with, both for-profit and nonprofit, and then get very specific to the nonprofit world and talking about practical considerations for implementing an approach like this, and I'll talk about a case study with an organization that I'm involved with. So when you think about applying big data for talent management, there are really 7 key specialized areas that you can look at taking data and answering questions using big data analytics. And those 7 key areas are displayed on the slide in front of me: recruiting, onboarding, something that we call Connect here at Cornerstone. Other organizations call this social enterprise, learning, performance, compensation practices, and how you put together succession plans. In these 7 key areas, the most common questions that we see organizations trying to answer using big data analytics based on the data they have accessible and the types of analyses like I'm going to walk you through are the following. In recruiting, the most common question that organizations we find trying to answer with big data analytics are, how do I predict who will stay longer in this job and perform better? I think there's not an organization on the face of the planet who wouldn't say if they knew the definitive answer to this question, they would be operating at a much higher level. With things like performance and learning, we see organizations wanting to figure out which factors predict who will become a higher performer. In some cases, we see organizations wanting to know which factors predict who will become a lower performer. In learning, for example, the classic question that we come across a number of times is, how do I predict who will be out of compliance, i.e., how do I predict of the people who I have currently assigned to training courses or curricula, which of those people are most likely to not complete them, and how do I fix that ahead of when it happens? In compensation, the age-old question of how do I pay people, right? Which incentive pay structures will drive better performance is a key question that we've seen organizations trying to answer. And lastly, in succession, this is one that's been coming up a lot recently, and it has come up even specifically within the nonprofit that I'm involved with. Which skills or competencies drive promotion so that we can focus on the core group of people within the organization that we can manage for appropriate succession tracks. These are just examples, by the way. There are, at Cornerstone, we work with over 2,000 organizations. I could tell you that for any one organization who's trying to use big data analytics today to find predictive recommendations, they may have dozens or even hundreds of questions in any one of these key areas. So let's talk about how organizations have traditionally been trying to answer questions using analytics, and then I'm going to make a proactive recommendation for how we think organizations should be doing this going forward. Traditionally, what we've found is that organizations of any size, when they're doing talent management analytics, generally are working with 3 specific data sets. They've got data that is already being produced out of the transactional systems that track talent management processes. And we call that data you have. Data you have are things like the hire and termination dates that sit in your HR management system, right? It doesn't require that you actually customize or do anything differently in your use of the system, but it's being automatically produced and tracked in a database. Then there's what we call data you collect. Data you collect comes from specific instances of your systems that you've set up to collect additional data on people. And that's everything from engagement surveys, pre-employment assessments if you're using them, performance reviews, and so on and so forth. And lastly, there's benchmark data. And benchmark data in most organizations that we've seen historically is accessed via somebody in the organization purchasing a third-party study that provides some level of benchmarking at the peer or industry level. And so what we've seen without exception is when organizations have been traditionally trying to mine this data and do analytics projects, they put a combination of these resources against these 3 data sources. They use internal analysts. So if you're fortunate enough to have budget to hire people who dedicate their full-time effort to doing data science or analysis, then these are the types of people that we've seen working on it. They may hire external consultants. They may use third-party software. So there are a variety of third-party software packages that can be connected to data sources, and these software packages are generally getting better and better at helping visualize data to drive really important conclusions that end up yielding outputs of the big data analytics study. And then in many cases, organizations are using historical precedent or best guess. And it's important to call these out as specific strategies or tactics that are being used, because they are. In the world of nonprofit, as I'm all too familiar, we're forced to deal with limited resources. And in some cases, looking at a data set, identifying a pattern that looks like it is in line with historical precedent or something that we've seen in the past is as far as an analytics project may go. And in some cases, it can yield important conclusions that can help the organization. Ultimately, what comes out of these types of resources being put against these three primary data sources are two things. One, a report. And again, these reports can be as sophisticated as something that gets automatically spit out of that third-party software that may have been configured. It may be something as simple as a manual graph that's being put together in Excel or off of some other third-party database. And then there's a framework for action. And the framework for action most typically is a project plan that gets emailed around to the key stakeholders in any project, telling them, here are the key conclusions that we've seen in the report, and here are the things we would suggest doing so that we act on them and make our systems better able to capture data going forward and help us implement solutions that will better the organization based on the conclusions that we're seeing. Without fail, every organization we've talked to who's doing analytics for talent management has a configuration that is some combination of the things on this slide. And what we're recommending organizations do to take the next step, and again, I'll give you a real-life example of this in just a few minutes, is to use a slightly different process that gets a bit more specific in a couple key areas. And so the first step that we think is really important in implementing any big data analytics project, whether you're a nonprofit or otherwise, is figuring out which of the data elements you are already tracking are even related. Now, this sounds deceptively simple, right? If you were to look at all the data that you're tracking, some of you might think that just by eyeballing the data set, you could identify, okay, well, let's just figure out which of these data elements are important given the study that we're doing. And I'll give you an example. You may say, well, if I want to understand what the impact of, say, rate of pay has on attrition in our organization, then you might think that the most important things to look at are purely just the amount that you're paying your people and the turnover data that comes from your HR management system. In fact, what many studies have shown is that there are other tangential data elements that actually will influence answering a question like the one I've just posed. For example, even when you're trying to identify the impact that someone's compensation has on their likelihood of leaving the organization, it's important to also take into consideration other data elements that you wouldn't ordinarily think have an impact on that particular equation, namely who somebody's manager is. So we've found, for example, that rate of pay has some impact on driving extended tenure, but when you don't take into account who somebody's manager is when you're trying to increase or decrease their rate of pay, it may completely obfuscate the effect that you've demonstrated by seeing the difference between how much you pay them and whether they stick around. So just figuring out which data elements are related is something that is done to basically winnow down the data that you have in these three categories that we've talked about to a much more manageable subset of data elements to be working with. And figuring out which data is related, this isn't black magic. Anybody with a relatively good background in statistics, understanding how to run regression analyses, for example, and control for controlling variables, will be able to do this using largely off-the-shelf software. So you don't need to go out and purchase really expensive new systems. It's more a general knowledge of statistics so that you can figure out which elements are related. Now, once you've figured out which elements are related, i.e. which data dimensions should you even be analyzing, you're not done. Now you need to figure out how these items are correlated, right? So if we've got a collection of items that we know are related to one another, we need to find out in what order they're related to one another. So for example, identifying for people in a given role within a given industry with certain skills or competencies who take certain classes within a given format, do those people tend to have better performance, higher compliance, or higher tenure, for example? Again, all that is needed here is somebody with I would say, an intermediate knowledge of statistics. The other really good news for nonprofits is that with the massive rise of what are called massive online, I always forget the second O in that, massively open online courses. There are a number of large players in this space. It's very easy to, at little or no cost, assign very robust training regimens to people to get them up to speed on how to be able to do the types of statistical analyses required to actually do what's shown on this slide. In fact, I think last time I checked, the most popular MOOC, massively online, why do I have a hard time? Massively open online course today is actually a course on data science and artificial intelligence that's offered by a Stanford professor. I think by last count, every time they offer this course, they get tens of thousands of people signing up for it. And it's like a 6-week course that's fairly intensive. I believe it's free, too, so just, again, by way of example. And lastly, while we still think it's obviously very important to have a framework for action coming out of your analytics projects, we would advocate that the way to do this going forward, the new way of doing predictive analytics, is to try and set up the systems that you have or systems that you're thinking about using to enable action to take place within the system based on the analysis you're finding, instead of requiring people to have to structure a separate project plan outside of it. This gets to basic human behavior. We've seen that when you do custom analytics projects, when you're using third-party off-the-shelf software, you've got a team of analysts trying to answer questions, finding out what's related, finding out how these elements are correlated, and then you force your implementation team to have to put together a separate project plan for how to implement these changes outside of the systems that are being used to analyze them. That's where a lot of the breakdown occurs, right? It's just hard to coordinate tracking the implementation of projects or programs that come out of big data analysis. And so there are ways in which you can configure applications that you're already using. And again, Cornerstone is in the process of developing specific functionality within our platform that enables you to act on conclusions that are being surfaced from the data right within the platform. And so it takes out a lot of uncertainty and potential volatility around the implementation phase of the project. So if you can remember these 3 steps, relate, correlate, and act, it might be the most important thing you could take away from this seminar, because that's how we would recommend structuring projects to do big data analytics. I understand all too well that finding resources, whether that's internal or external, to do these projects can be extremely challenging, particularly for nonprofits. I can tell you I was with one of the largest telcos in the world a few months ago. This is an organization who is obviously a for-profit. They can pay at absolutely top of market, and they were saying that the single biggest challenge facing the organization, this is a company with over 100,000 employees, in the coming years ahead, was how they were going to be able to hire enough data scientists to just do analytics projects like the one I'm just talking about. So again, I know it's difficult. My recommendations around doing what I've walked through in the last 3 slides would be, again, find people who are intellectually curious within your organization. They're quantitatively capable. Maybe they took some statistics classes in college, or they were a math major. They're comfortable with numbers, comfortable with statistics. Get them some incremental training available through very efficient or free online avenues, and then they should be able to do some of the things like the example I'm going to walk through here in just a moment. So let me talk about some of the key findings that we found here at Cornerstone that I think are applicable to the nonprofit world. And really what I see these key findings as, these are free insights that you can use to drive major strategic benefit in your organization without having to do the analysis yourself. And the way in which we found these, by the way, is by looking across what we call network data at Cornerstone. So again, if we think back to that slide where I talked about the advent of SaaS and everything being tracked in the same object model, at Cornerstone, all 2,000 plus customers and organizations that we work with, their data is tracked in the same format. And that enables us to look across that data in an anonymized and aggregated fashion and find very strong correlations, predictions, and recommendations that hold true regardless of industry, job type, geography, specialized talent management area, what have you. And here are some of the things that we found. Number 1, job hoppers and non-job hoppers are equally likely to remain in their jobs. So let me get more specific. When we looked across all of the people who had applied for a variety of jobs. Now the caveat here is primarily entry-level jobs, which makes up the majority of employment anyway. But regardless of industry or job type what we found is that the number of full-time jobs that you've had in the 5 years leading up to your point of application have zero statistical correlation to your likelihood of success or tenure in the job you're applying for. And this is particularly important because studies have shown that the average recruiter spends about 15 seconds scanning a resume when they decide who they should prioritize for further processing in looking at an employment application. And primarily what they're looking for is, does this person seem like they'd be a job hopper? Have they been hopping around to different jobs or had short-term tenure in their last 4 or 5 years? And we've proven this statistically incorrect. Something that's related, and I think even more important to the economic agenda of today, is that the long-term unemployed also showed statistically equal chances of performing just as well and staying just as long, and in some jobs even longer than their employed counterparts. This conclusion, it surprised even me that when we published our findings around this and we said, hey, look, the long-term unemployed, which, by the way, happens to make up one of the largest remaining chunks of the unemployed today, when we released our findings around this, I fielded a call from the Secretary of Labor at the White House, who then invited me to participate in a closed-door discussion at the White House with CHROs from some of the largest companies in the country to talk about this very study, right? What data had we been able to uncover that showed that people who were long-term unemployed were just as good, if not better, than people who were already employed? And this is an area where I think, and I would encourage you all to take advantage of this, because despite the fact that we've released this finding and put lots of data behind it, we still find that organizations are reluctant to act on it. And in a world where in some cases, I mean, I'm in the Bay Area and our unemployment right now is running sub 5%. This is an area of sourcing that can be very strategic to you, finding people who have been long-term unemployed and then finding other ways of screening them for their capabilities and motivations to do the job that they're applying for at your nonprofit. You'll be able to take advantage of people who are just as good, if not better, than other people who will be harder to pull out of their existing position. We've also found that employees who have high tech proficiency perform better and actually tend to be more reliable. And by more reliable, which relates to the military veterans conclusion, we actually looked at schedule adherence data. So we were able to determine that these people showed up for work on time 15% more and adhered to the schedules that were given to them 15% higher. Tech proficiency, we have a way of measuring within our proprietary application at Cornerstone, but there are ways in which all of you could find of doing this on your own. Another insight around military veterans that I mentioned, it just turns out that people who have performed military service in the United States are more dependable than people who have not. And again, dependable specifically means that their schedule adherence was notably higher, as was their on-the-job adherence to schedules, than people who are non-veterans. And then the last conclusion we found that I think is really fascinating, and this is very recent, is around what we call toxic employment. We did a study across our customers where we categorized reason codes that came out of their HR systems as toxic or non-toxic, reason codes at the point of termination. So if somebody was involuntarily terminated or they were fired, we would say, was this a toxic termination or not? And toxic terminations were reason codes like the following: fraud, financial misconduct, sexual harassment, rules and policy violations. They were a small handful of reason codes that everyone on this call would agree clearly delineate someone as being toxic. And we found some really interesting things. Number one, toxic terminations made up between 3 and 5% of all terminations across the customer base we looked at, which was surprising in and of itself. I was in a meeting with a very large, well-known technology company a few weeks back. I mentioned this statistic. I said, across our customer network, we saw that it was 3 to 5% of terminations are toxic. And the people in the room looked at me and said, well, there's no possible way that that could be true for our organization. We pride ourselves in hiring the best of the best. There's no way that we have, I'm sure that we have very little toxic terminations. They had an analyst go off and run a query on their data to see what percentage of their workforce had been terminated for toxic reasons, and they found they were right at the median, 4%. So the first thing that was surprising was just how much, of the terminations we were seeing were toxic. What was more surprising was that when we measured what we call the halo effect of toxic employees, so whether these people affect the people around them, we found an even more dramatic conclusion. That is that these people increase the voluntary quit rates of the people who work on their teams by over 50%. And what was even most important about this study was that you can identify what makes someone toxic at the point of application. So we probably don't have enough time for me to go into it here, but suffice it to say that we found some very unique and insightful characteristics of individuals that can be measured when they're applying for a job online that have an overwhelming correlation to toxic behavior in the workplace and subsequent terminations for toxic reasons. So these are just some of the findings that we found. Again, would be happy to touch on these in more detail if people have questions about them. I want to move now as we wrap up to talking about the practical considerations for implementing the approaches that we've talked about. And I'm going to walk through a case study, an example of an organization that I happen to be personally involved with. I serve on the board of a workforce development nonprofit in the Bay Area called JVS. And so the first practical consideration for implementing is start simple. This is, I have now talked with organizations, large and small, sophisticated and unsophisticated, people who have done some really amazing analytics projects. And this happens to be the #1 reason that organizations get tripped up and then unfortunately decide not to embark on further analytics projects after their initial attempts. They'll start out trying to answer a very complicated question. You know, for example, I walked through the toxic employees example, and that was an organization that we were working with when we did that, where they'd done 4 or 5 simpler big data analytics projects before that, and if they tried to start with toxic employee halo effect type analytics, they probably would have fallen flat. And the reason is really simple. You need to get people in the organization bought into just seeing that this approach can work. And the best way to do that is to start with really easy questions that you have clean existing data around. And I put an emphasis on clean. So again, a great example of a simple data analytics project you could take on would be to look at what impact do the sources that people apply from or the pass rates that we see in interviewing people drive attrition on the job. These are all areas in which you probably have very reliable and clean data in, and thus you will spend a lot less time on the front end of the project trying to figure out how data gets ingested and how it gets cleaned up, anonymized, and aggregated so that you can do the project correctly. And it is somewhat related to my second point, which is ensure that you have reliable data. And this is something that I'll mention in the example I'll talk about using JVS. Sometimes when you identify the question you want to answer and you know that you have the right sources of data, you'll find that those data sources aren't tracking the data in the way that you need it to be tracked so that you can do the analysis that you want to do. And the saying garbage in is garbage out has never been more relevant than when doing analytics projects. One example here that I'll give you is it's very common, and I still have no idea why, although I have some hypotheses about it, but it's very common that we will get an HR data feed from a customer on attrition, and we will see, in some cases, hundreds of people who have been hired after their termination date. And these are not rehires, by the way. So literally within the system that the company is using, it says, this person was terminated on June 1st, 2015, and they were hired on June 24th, 2015, which we all know to be physically impossible. My hypothesis about this, by the way, is that this is in organizations where they tend to do batch processing of hiring data. So they have one person on the HR team in charge of putting in everyone's hire date at the end of the month, and they're not accommodating for short-term turnover, people who joined for a few days and left, and therefore it drives this weird phenomenon. And lastly, and this is especially important in the nonprofit world, and I've seen a lot of organizations get off track here, is make sure you align to your core mission, to the core mission of the organization that you're a part of. And the example I'll give here, and it nicely transitions into the last thing I'll talk about here as a case study, is JVS. So JVS is a Bay Area nonprofit. It could be broadly characterized as a workforce development organization. We're more specifically focused on helping Bay Area job seekers build skills and find jobs to achieve self-sufficiency. The organization has been around for over 40 years. We, at the time we started doing some big data analytics work that I'll talk you through here in a second, we were running, I think, over 40 separate programs to help people build skills and find jobs to achieve self-sufficiency. And those programs varied from something as light as a one-day or several-hour resume building workshop that would help people brush up on what's on their resume so that they could get a job, all the way through to 5-week intensive job search boot camps where people were there all day, every day for a 5-week period so that they could get a leg up on how they could do better at getting jobs in specific targeted industries. And so at JVS, we basically said, we want to evaluate what is driving success for us. And the first thing we said is we have to define what success means. So we defined our success metric as placement outcomes. We said, you know, in a world where we're trying to help connect people with meaningful employment to achieve self-sufficiency, the best success outcome is getting a job, are the things that we're helping train these people on getting them jobs. And when we identified that success metric, we went to our system of record, which happens to be Salesforce.com. So we had configured Salesforce to be tracking all of the relevant placement data about our candidates, as well as biographic and demographic data on people. And the first thing we realized, which relates to one of the things that I've talked about earlier, is that we actually didn't have all of the data we needed in the right format to do this kind of analysis. So while we were tracking placement, i.e. where people got placed, we weren't actually tracking their starting wage. And this was really important and gets to the aligned to the mission piece, because at JVS, an important component of our mission is helping people not only get a job, but achieve economic self-sufficiency. And for anyone who lives in the Bay Area or is familiar with what's going on in the local housing and employment market there, it is becoming harder and harder for the average American to live in the Bay Area. I saw a recent statistic the other day which kind of blew my mind, which was in a world where they say that you should not be spending more than 30% of your pre-tax income on housing. That means that in the San Francisco Bay Area, somebody needs to have a median salary of over $120,000 a year so that they can afford to purchase an independent home in the Bay Area and not spend more than a third of their pre-tax income on housing. So this economic self-sufficiency piece was very important to our mission, and we weren't tracking the starting wage. So we reconfigured Salesforce to track the starting wage of the people that we were placing into jobs, and then we went back and reran the analysis, and we found something that, again, also helped us better calibrate our approach to better align to our mission, and that was that we were able to see which programs we were running that drove higher placement success rates and we were able to see the wages that people were getting. And the really good news was that we saw what we were hoping to see, that there was a small collection of programs we were running that had overwhelmingly higher success rates at placing people into jobs that had a higher starting wage. So that was great news. The bad news for us was that even the starting wage that we were placing people into in the programs that were most successful wasn't quite at what is called the economic self-sufficiency wage for the Bay Area, right? So we set about trying to answer the question, is it possible for us to design programs differently to put people into jobs that will, right out of the gate, have the self-sufficiency wage? And there was a bit of bad news and good news here. The bad news is we determined that it's largely not possible to place the majority of our clients that we service into jobs that have a starting wage that is at economic self-sufficiency. It's just the virtue of the problem that we're trying to solve. People who don't have jobs or who have been out of the workforce for a long time immediately achieving a self-sufficiency wage in the jobs they're placed in it wasn't certainly tenable for us to do as a single driving mission of our placement strategy. What we did find, the good news was that there were a collection of jobs that were identified as what have now become known as pathway employment jobs that would lead to economic self-sufficiency. So to use an example, putting somebody into an entry-level teller role at a retail bank had a much higher likelihood of putting that person on a pathway to becoming a branch manager or a supervisor in that same banking organization, which in turn had a self-sufficiency wage attached to it. So this is where we really got into the true big data analytics piece, and now what we're doing is we're working on using the data we have to regress back to the specific programs that we can design and implement at JVS that will put people into pathway jobs, which in and of themselves have a higher correlation with putting people on a track to self-sufficiency. We did all of this using our internal resources and systems that we already had available. We did have some people internally brush up on their statistical knowledge. We were also very fortunate in some of the people who were working at JVS had already brought to bear through some of their previous education background a working knowledge of how to practically apply statistical software applications. But ultimately, we used very limited resources to get a massive impact. And I will tell you that the work that we did here is now helping us figure out how we even further realign the mission of the organization going forward so that we can better stay aligned with having quantifiably better success outcomes for our clients, which helps us with pretty much every aspect of the operation. So I know I've done a lot of talking, and I think I've stayed relatively true to the timing I was hoping to do here. So with that, why don't I stop, and I will open it up for questions to the extent there are some, and I'm going to turn to Justin for the logistics of how we do that.
Thanks, Max. So right now we'll enter the Q&A portion of today's presentation. Everyone has a chat box in the middle right-hand side of your screen. If you do have questions, if something came up during the presentation you'd like to hear more about, please feel free to submit those questions through the chat box now. And as the presentation was going, we already had a couple questions stream in. So we're going to start with those. Again, as we're going through these, feel free to submit anything else that you'd like us to address. Max, a question that immediately came in was quite simple. What is clean data?
Well, let me start by saying that the good news is that every organization, let me put it different way. We've never seen an organization with 100% perfect clean data. So I would not be surprised if a lot of our data is dirty to begin with, but let me try and directly answer the question. What is clean data? Clean data is data that adheres to a standard and demonstrates a pattern of correlations that is similar to what you would normally observe in the real world. And again, I'll use a very simple example as attrition data. So clean attrition data would be, by definition, data that tracks the date that someone starts their employment, the date that someone ends their employment, a standardized reason code for why their employment was ended, and whether it was involuntary or voluntary. And you would know that data was clean if you could run a very simple query on a data set. So let's just say you pulled this out of your HR system and found that there were no termination dates that happened prior to an actual hire date, right? That's how you know you would have clean data in that specific data set. I can give you, another more detailed example. We work with organizations who track daily productivity metrics on their people. So they may have people working in customer service, for example, and they track how many interactions their people have with customers every day. If these people are working in a phone-based environment, it's not uncommon, excuse me, for a single individual to handle over 100 interactions a day. And so in that environment, let's just say, for sake of using a nice round number, that the typical person, from observation, from real-world observation, you walk around the company floor, you interact with people, you take escalated calls, you know that a typical person is handling somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 phone calls a day. You know that you have dirty data if, when you pull the data from your system that tracks phone calls, you see that the median number of interactions somebody is handling is 15, right? And I know that it would seem simple, right? It'd say, well, if you've set up a system to track phone calls or customer interactions, you would think that it would track every single one. And you will find that organizations have found ways of implementing this technology or putting processes in place that allow people to work outside of the system that show that you don't have clean data. Again, to look at that on the positive side, if you know from observations that people handle roughly 100 calls a day, and you pull a data pool that shows across the 500 or 1,000 people you have working in customer service, the median number of interactions is 102, then you know you've got a pretty clean data set to be working with. Other questions?
Awesome, thank you. We do have a few other questions, and perhaps the most popular, this has come from quite a few people, goes back to toxic employees. What were some of those characteristics that you would recommend looking out for to gauge toxicity prior to hiring?
Yeah, this one's come up a lot, so I'll touch on some of the highlights. Toxic employees, people who tend to get terminated for toxic reason codes overwhelmingly, are more overconfident. So they tend to demonstrate higher degrees of confidence in answering self-assessment questions. And then they also happen to be less honest, which is not a surprise. But let me give you an example of how we actually measured that in our application. We came up with an honesty score that also was able to assess confidence and overconfidence. And the way it worked was actually very simple. Early in our online application, it measures a number of traits about individuals. We would ask the person to self-assess their proficiency in using technical applications, right? So we'd say, on a 5-point scale of novice to expert, rank your proficiency in the use of Microsoft Word. And then what we would do later in the application is we would actually assess that person's capabilities at using the application we'd ask them to self-assess their proficiency on, right? And we would measure the distance between someone's actual knowledge of, say, keyboard commands in Microsoft Word with their assessed proficiency. So, for example, if overconfident people who also were overwhelmingly dishonest would say, I'm an expert level user at Microsoft Word. And by the way, the things that we assessed them on later from a skills perspective were basic functionality. What's the keyboard command for cutting text, for example? People who said they were expert level users but who didn't know basic Microsoft Word knowledge, we were able to demonstrate were both overconfident and also in our construct realm dishonest. And we found that these people tended to have much, much higher incidence rates of toxic employment. Now, one other thing I'll leave you with, which I think is kind of fascinating, is that when we were looking at what other correlations we saw with dishonesty, we found that it had a positive correlation to nearly every on-the-job productivity metric that we would expect, with one exception. So in other words, people who were dishonest were worse at nearly every measurable on-the-job productivity metric, with one group of metrics as an exception, and that was sales. So we found, statistically speaking, that people who were scoring higher on the dishonesty scale were actually seeing better performance in things like upsell, cross-sell metrics, and reaching their sales quota faster. Sales teams hate me for bringing up that statistic, by the way, but I still think it's interesting.
Awesome. Our next question has to do with education on big data. The question reads, there are schools popping up out of the woodwork offering data science programs left and right. Do you have any recommendations for programs or schools or the correct route to get educated on this?
Yeah, it's a great question. Again, I'm trying to limit my answer to the framework of nonprofit, and I just would, the level of quality in the MOOCs that are out there focused on data science that are either free or close to free is, in my opinion, almost as good as the programs that are much more involved and are quite expensive. So, for example, I know that much more involved, more expensive programs are things like General Assembly, where you can go to a intensive 6-week or 12-week program. I think it's several $1,000s. Very similar to what you'd pay for that course at a 4-year university if you were thinking about it on a ratable basis. And I haven't seen any difference in quality in something like you could access with, and I always get them confused, but Udemy and the other big one, Coursera, sorry, that offer courses that are just as good. And again, if you have to pay for them, I think they're usually in the neighborhood of like $100 to $200, but many of them are free. And I have, and this is really, I think, just a wonderful innovation for the world of professional development. I haven't seen a noticeable impact in quality in the topics that are covered or the level of knowledge that's developed. What I do think you get when you buy the more expensive course that's more involved, oftentimes involves you going to a brick and mortar location to take it, is the classic thing you get when you're paying real money for a course like that, which is you now have a natural incentive to make sure that the person who's taking the course is going to actually show up, pay attention, and complete it. By far the biggest challenge that organizations like Coursera and Udemy deal with is that they have thousands and thousands of people sign up for courses, but their level of engagement and actual retention of the information drops off throughout the course because they're just not making as big of a commitment. So I'd say as long as you can, if you can identify people who are naturally curious, who want to develop this knowledge, who can really want to build a career in data science, and they're committed to doing the coursework and following the programs, I would encourage you to focus on the the cheaper or free programs because they're just as good as the ones that you have to pay for. So I think that probably wraps up our session. It doesn't look like we have any more questions. Again, I wanted to thank everyone for making the time, and I hope this was valuable for you all, and I'd be happy to answer other questions separately. You can email Justin my contact information, and I'm more than happy to talk with you at length further.
Awesome. And Max, thank you so much. I really enjoyed that presentation. From the feedback that we're getting through chat, sounds like a lot of people were able to take a lot away from it. As a reminder, today's recording will be available on the Foundation's nonprofitready.org learning portal within 24 hours. We'll be sending a follow-up to everyone who attended today with a link to this location. And once you get that email, you'll also have mine. You can reply with any questions you may have had about the presentation or anything that we covered. We'll do our best to address those in a timely fashion. So again, thank you to Max for an awesome presentation. Thank you to today's attendees.